Good morning. Paul Lips from the Salt Center of the World Union for Progressive Judaism in Jerusalem. Every now and again I'm asked to make some comments about what's going on in Israel, and that's basically the challenge this morning as well. I always say that what we really have to start off doing is to try and get a sense of the Middle East, and that isn't particularly easy. A few days ago I was speaking to a colleague of mine at Tel Aviv University, and I asked an innocent question, and I said, what's the most serious problem facing the Middle East? Expecting that he'd speak about Iraq or Syria or Libya, and he said, you know, to make analysis of the Middle East today is totally impossible. So let me try and make the impossible possible. Let me try and make a few comments. Firstly, some of the points which we know are becoming clearer. Not only is the Middle East in crisis, but the whole concept of the nation state is beginning to break down. I've been looking at this closely over the last few months and even years, and unfortunately, although Syria looks a little bit better than it did in the past, the truth is that Syria, Iraq, Libya and Yemen are up for grabs in terms of being the old-style nation state. And where will that really go? Well, one doesn't quite know. The other issue, which I think is very clear, is the remarkable change that has been brought about as a result of the involvement in Russia. Initially, people thought they were going to be short-time partners, but President Putin of Russia is a sophisticated man, and when he says he's withdrawing, it basically means he's waiting on the sideline to come back at yet another stage. The global dynamics of how American leaders behave, in most cases, particularly President Obama, and how a dictator like Putin behaves, means that the Russians can do what they want, when they want, how they want, and this is very different from a country which has to relate to the wider wishes of the population. One other issue I think which is important is the possible decline of the power of ISIS. And here comes a question. As ISIS gets weaker in the Middle East, does it get stronger in Europe? And I think this is what we have to anticipate in the months and years to come. All of us have been horrified by the events in Brussels, and earlier than that, the events in Paris. Is Europe essentially insecure at the present time? The Israelis have a great deal to say about it, and every now and again I wish we weren't so bombastic about our comments. We do not yet know how to solve many of our terror-based activities and problems. But having said that, it does seem that we're living in a changing world. We're living in a world where many of the beliefs and hopes and dreams of people, that we would all become more democratic, open-minded, understanding, tolerant, may unfortunately not be the case. And radical organizations, radical moments of history, have always brought about contrary and contradictory radical phenomenon on the other side. If we just look at Brussels in the last few days, the early rise of the radical right has to say something very important to us. Radical left leads to radical right in history, and radical right, we know, often leads to radical left. That is really a situation. Where is the silent majority? Where is the voice of many of us who are trying to balance a very confusing world where great extremes seem to be facing us and great tragedies are just behind us? I think this is the challenge for the future. Can the reform movement really be a voice of sanity in a world which may be less than sane at the time? That seems to be very important. If we look at just one or two other components of the wider environment, we have to recognize that Israel is presenting a very, very awkward face to the wider world. The killing of a Palestinian terrorist by an Israeli soldier has become a major event, minute by minute, in Israeli society. The Israeli Prime Minister, who started off by giving an analytical analysis and approach to what happened, quickly came around to a populist approach. And I think we have to recognize that in Israel there is a tension between winning the war and remaining, or trying to remain, a democrat. Reform movement, we have also faced recently some wonderful ups, but unfortunately some very problematic downs as well. The up was clearly the decision being made by the government to increase the area available in the Kotel for the reform and conservative movements in Israel. It seemed to be a real move forward. Unfortunately, the Israeli Prime Minister in the last few days is starting to backtrack. The Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox voice, is very sophisticated, very powerful, and, as we all know from the election results over the last few decades, very well organized. As soon as the ultra-Orthodox start pressurizing the government, and as soon as Bibi Netanyahu begins to feel that his coalition is under threat, they become increasingly powerful. He sinks into a no decision kind of mode, and the Israeli phenomenon, which is known by governments all around the world, to give in at the very moment when there seems to be pressure and hand it over, as in this particular case, to the cabinet secretary, or in many situations to yet another commission of inquiry, is always a bad sign, because it seems to be an indication of backtracking. I think we have to follow this very, very clearly. Rabbi Gilad Kariv has made a very important point, and for all of those who are watching this and listening to me at the moment, I think should pay attention to what he said. He said, global Jewry is watching the situation of freedom of religion and the equality of all the religious groups very, very closely. And world Jewry has a voice. And I think it's true. And sometimes I do wonder, sitting here in Israel, where the world Jewry has really picked up the challenge and really said to the Israeli government that if you want Israel to be a representative of both its citizens and global Jewry, then you have to be sensitive to the needs of all, regardless of whether someone lives in Israel or not. And this, I think, is a very important challenge for the future. The Haredim are becoming more powerful, not only in numbers. They remain more or less 9 or 10% of the Israeli population, but they're becoming more powerful in terms of the political arena. They see a weak prime minister, and that's always a wonderful moment for them to really stand up and push hard. I think we, Reform and conservative Jews, also have to push hard, and I believe that is a very important challenge. Let me try and end with some positive components in everything that I've spoken about. On the one hand, it does seem good that ISIS, this awful symbol of Islamic fundamentalism, is becoming weaker. That, I think, is good. The other good news is that unfortunately, through pain and tragedy, I believe that Europe is becoming more sophisticated and beginning to understand that we are at the moment at a very difficult stage, and one doesn't have to give up democracy to defend one's population. That seems to be good. And the third good bit of news is that remarkably, in a country as complex as Israel, figures show that in 2015, foreign investment has grown by over 80% as compared with last year. So, in some senses, we may be living better than we have in the past. In other senses, I think we've got a long way to go before we achieve the kind of country that many of us have dreamed of. Thank you and shalom.